I have one of the question, or not question, but one of the themes I thought would be interesting to go through is Corflu, because until last year, you've gone to every single Corflu, put on one of them. How does,
Well, initially I was dubious about Corflu. I blame it again on Lucy Hunsinger. When Lucy was at that '83 Worldcon in Baltimore, she was talking up the first prospective Corflu there, and to me in particular, she really, really wanted me to come to it.
Mhm.
Now, I knew Lucy before that convention. I had met her at the Westercon earlier that year, and I had already marked her down as somebody who had that fanish spark in their eyes, who was increasingly rare by then, particularly among girls. I mean, women have always been a minority in fandom, but it's not a desired state. I mean, I think we were all much happier when the ratios came closer to 50-50. Because some of us, myself in particular, having been a fan all our lives, we look first to fandom for prospective mates. And there were damn few prospective mates out there for much of the time. I was lucky that I met and married several, but all fans, all women that I met through fandom, and I'm happy about that. But what was the point? Where were we going with
Just
this?
Corflu, just go.
Corfu, right?
Cor-
Yeah. So Lucy's talking to me about Corfu, and then she's living with me that fall. You can bet she's talking Corfu, and she gets me to commit. And it was something like January in the Bay Area, actually in the same hotel where the '64 Worldcon was held, which was a really charming old heap of a hotel
Mhm.
with a nice restaurant. Once when I was in the Bay Area visiting, I took Terry and Carol Carr to that restaurant just because I could. But so she prevailed upon me to come out and go to it. And that first Corfu was kind of tentative in a lot of ways, kind of a trial balloon, trying lots of ideas, not all of which worked, like the multiple programming threads when you've only got 50 or 60 people. I mean, that was a weird joke because at one point Terry and I were on I don't know what you'd call a panel, more like a maybe a seminar on hand stenciling artwork, and it was in the same room, but another corner with a panel of some kind that Dave Hartwell was conducting, and nobody came to ours. So Terry and I went over and joined theirs.
Hmm.
Obviously you don't need competing program items when you have so few people.
Mhm.
But otherwise, it was very enjoyable. And at one point, uh, I'm sitting around talking with Rich Brown, and Rich says to me, Ted, we should do a Corfu. Now, I believe at that point, Rich might still have been living with, what was her name? Uh, she was originally a West Coast fan who moved to
Linda
Virginia.
Blanchard.
Linda Blanchard, yes. So, very active for a brief period of time and subsequently married a British fan and kind of disappeared into Gaffia, unfortunately. But I think he originally was talking about him and her doing it. Somehow I got roped into it too.
Of course.
And then he and she broke up, and then it was just Rich and me. And so we went to talk to the people putting on that first Corfu, a group of three women, and they said to us, uh, you can, it'd be good to have somebody else do it, but not right away. We want to do the second one. So you can do the third one. And we said, okay, we'll go with that. And so the second one was held up in Napa Valley. And I guess I presented our bid, so-called. There were no competing bids. Bill Bowers had come up to me at that convention and was talking to me about wanting to do one, and I said, why don't you do the one after ours? Which is exactly the way it worked out. And in the process, we sort of established this tradition of non-competitive bidding for Corflus. I mean, the whole thing about competitive bidding where Worldcons are concerned is it becomes an industry. You know, all the parties you have to throw, all the money you have to spend, all the PR you have to do. All of that, if you're a big convention, you've got the resources for. But if you're like a little 100-person convention, that's a real waste of resources and totally unnecessary. And so, you know, we just sort of agreed on what I guess would once have been called a gentleman's agreement, maybe just now a gentle person's agreement, who can say, that people who wanted to do a Corflu would get in line and inevitably be accommodated. And this has worked out very well over the years. In fact, some years we've had to really dig to find someone to do the next year's. Frank Lundy and I in Toronto at the first Toronto Corflu really had to twist Pat Bursey's arm to get her to bid because there was nobody bidding for the next Corflu at that point. And we were coming down to the wire. And I promised Pat I'd help her out, and I did, and she put on an excellent Corflu, which is the point. I think almost all the Corflus have been excellent in one way or another. They've all been very individually done, but they've reflected the people who put them on in the various ways, the philosophies and so forth of putting on a Corflu. And over the years, we've pretty well whipped it into shape. My belief is that there's only one reason to have programming at the Corflu, and that is it has to be interesting to the attendees. There is no point in having a program item that you can easily miss at a Corflu because, again, you're only there for a limited period of time. There's only a limited amount of programming. It ought to be essential. It isn't always. I mean, sometimes it certainly hasn't been. But in general, that's what it should be. That's what it should aspire to be, you know. And I think in general, people have handled this pretty well over the years. I was really sorry that I couldn't go to last year's, but it was sort of a confluence of different things. One of them was finances. I'm always on the edge financially, but I usually can find a couple $1,000 to scrape together to do a course just once a year. But then there was the location, and the location was not easily accessible. It wasn't like you flew into an airport and took a shuttle to the hotel. You'd fly into an airport and rent a car and drive a couple 100 miles to a hotel, or you know, get a ride with someone else. Or, I mean, there weren't even just one airport, so you had several different choices, and none of them were ideal. And people tried to fix me up with rides and whatnot, and they involved spending times in people's houses overnight and stuff that I didn't really want to do. And that's because I'm a cantankerous old man and I have all these procedures I have to go through with my teeth and other things, and I just don't want to be bothered to do it in somebody else's bathroom while trying to sleep through somebody else's kids running around or any of that stuff. You know, it's easier not to do it. Now, I had up until then sort of maintained this principle that I would attend every Corfu every year, no matter what, which I adhered to for quite a few. I mean, 1984 until 2019. no, 2020. So, a good run. And initially, I had competition. My competitor was Art Woodner. And Art had also maintained an unbroken record of Corflus, but he broke it with the Annapolis Corflu, which he couldn't make, which was what, 2000, 2001, something like that. So at that point, I had the record, you know, for whatever it was worth, which wasn't much, but I had it, and I'd achieved it. I wasn't sure I needed to continue to achieve it. I'd like to, but what do you do at a Corfu? You hang out with your friends, and I find that this is increasingly more difficult for me for several reasons. One is I don't stand comfortably very long. So standing around in room parties is unpleasant for me. Secondly, my hearing isn't what it once was. And in consequence, if people speak rapidly or in accents that are difficult for me, it just goes right past me. And if it matters to me, I'll ask them to repeat themselves, but you can't keep doing that in a conversation, particularly in a conversation with multiple people in a crowded room, with this background noise and all the rest of that. So even the socializing part of it, which is the core of culture, hanging out with old friends, has become less enjoyable for me. And there's a movement to send me to the next Corflu, which we don't exactly know when or where it will be. Well, it will be in Britain, but in Bristol, but we don't know when. And I want to do it. We'll see whether or not I can do it, both in terms of flying between countries during COVID and all the rest of that, and just in terms of my own health. So I have to face the fact that I'm nearing the end of my life, and things are winding down for me in ways that are not necessarily pleasant.
Well, I hope we can get. We hope you will be able to make it. I hope I will be able to make it too.
And I'd like to see you there, John.
Yeah.
Maybe you're one of the old friends that I look forward to hanging out with.
Absolutely. And a lot of us are having the same problem, same kind of problems with crowded parties as we all become ancient. Well, I remember the logistics of parties when I started going to Fennec class, for instance, and also frequently room parties at conventions, would be sitting around rather than standing around. You'd often be sitting in your comfortable chair in Brooklyn, and people would literally be sitting around you and talking, or sometimes listening to you talk. You are here, and I've always liked that arrangement.
Yeah, I always saw that as more of a sitting around in a circle,
Mm-hmm.
not a literal circle, but I had both a couch and a kind of I don't know what you call it exactly, a backless couch, a set in sort of a thing that you could lie on if you wanted. It was upholstered and sprung, and you could actually sleep on it, although it was small for that. And they were kind of facing each other, and then there were a couple of other chairs. So there was the opportunity for people to group seated, not sitting on the floor necessarily, although when it got crowded, people did sit on the floor.
I did sometimes. I was young enough to then. And that's one of the things that always struck me about room parties and hotel rooms, because the bed is in the middle of the room, so it's sort of the opposite. People sort of it doesn't force people, but it makes it more likely for people to be facing in two different directions.
Yeah, if you're seated on a double bed or a queen or king size bed, and you're sitting on both sides in the ends, you're facing in both directions.
Yeah.
That I always liked about the room parties of conventions in the 50s and 60s was that they were conversational parties. When I went to a room party at Nikon 2, I would sit down and listen to Bob Tucker and FM Busby and who knows who all else talking, Walt Liebscher, any of those people telling stories. People would tell stories. And I was as entranced as any other young fan would be to hear those stories and to hear them from the lips of the people who lived them. I mean, I've actually heard the actual story of Rosebud from Walt Liebscher, which is not insignificant, but also not repeatable.
I think I've heard it too.
But, in those days, it wasn't like it was later where the parties were that crowded. They were typically less than a dozen people. And they were referred to as closed door room parties. Meaning you needed an invite. They weren't just open to anybody who came by. You needed to know somebody to get into them. And I remember at Nikon too, where both Ron Ellik and I were there. And Ron was more, let us say, bushy-tailed in those days. And Bob Tucker in particular, would slip me the room numbers. He'd saddle up to me in the afternoon or early evening and say, room such and such at 9 o'clock or whenever, And I would say, great. But I was not appreciated by some of the others who were my superiors for the fact that I then passed that room number on to Ron. Ron was not as welcome at those parties as I was, and I believe I was sort of fringe welcome at that point. I mean, I was not anybody's favorite fan. I was perhaps becoming well known, but I wasn't anywhere near BNF or anything like that. I was just another young fan who did some things that people liked and some things they didn't like. So, and Ron was in the same boat. Ron and I were the same fan generation. We started putting out fanzines within a month or two of each other. But that was how that went. Now, Ron at that time was living in the West Coast, and he had hitchhiked to New York for that Worldcon. I asked him how he was getting back, and he said, same way. So I offered him a ride down to DC with me in my car after the convention. And then he took him out to Route 50. And last I saw him then was with his thumb out, but he successfully got back to the West Coast. And I liked Ron. I saw a fair amount of him over the years. In '65, he took a freighter to the UK for the Worldcon in London. You could, book a berth on a freighter. They would have maybe a half dozen or so berths, and you dined at the captain's table. It was pretty nice, all things considered, but it was a freighter. And so I drove him out to the New Jersey docks where the freighter was that he was boarding. That was fascinating. And then I saw him in London, and he had borrowed somebody's VW van. Might have been Harry Harrison's, I don't know. And we went out on an afternoon run to get supplies for the art show. We ended up in Harrods, actually, because what we needed were things to make ribbons and seals with. And this was not an easy concept to communicate to the people in the stores where we went. It was quite frustrating. But we spent, several hours doing this, during which time, particularly on driving parts, Ron is regaling me with stories from the West Coast fandom and some of the juicier gossip. But I won't repeat that now.
I had not actually met Ron, though I've been reading his fanzines and stuff, until just before he died. I met him at your New Year's party when he was in New York. Unfortunately, it was that a few weeks later, that he drove west and was killed in a car accident.
Yeah, that was
yeah.
I was very sorry to hear that. I
I
forgot
have,
it was at my New Year's Eve party.
so it would be 67 because it was the beginning of 68, the second year of the jackpot. Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, well. I have also hitchhiked out Route 50 from Falls Church toward the West Coast, so I only got to St. Louis before I decided I'd get a drive away car.
A
I
lot of
don't know.
people were doing that too.
Yeah, I don't know what it was like when Ron was doing it, but when I was, people along Highway 50, unless they were truck drivers, would pick me up and say, "This road doesn't go to California." I say, "Yes, it does. It goes all the way. It goes right across the Bay Bridge." They would say, "Don't you want the interstate?" Oh well. I suggest that we take a brief intermission and then come back and see what's left, just so we can go pee or whatever.
What do you mean intermission?
I mean, I'm going to go off for a couple of minutes to the bathroom. Anybody else needs to, they can. And I'll come back and we'll see
Well,
what.
why don't I blather for a bit? Give me a topic to get started on.
Fan Writers of America.
Okay, that's a good topic. Take your bathroom break. Okay, this all came about from the 1974, was it, Worldcon in LA, where where the convention hotel was across the street from Disneyland rather, and it was a weird hotel. The I the first room I was given there was a big wedge-shaped room with windows on two sides and totally inadequate air conditioning. The sun coming in through those windows heated the room up, and I couldn't do much about it. So I had my room moved to a more interior room. And the air conditioning in that hotel was primitive. There was some kind of a unit located in the ceiling over the bathroom that fed air out into the little hallway into the main room. And it was entirely recirculated. There was no fresh air. The windows did not open. And I had room parties virtually every night. People would be hanging out. And there was a lot of smoking, both tobacco and other substances. And you'd get used to it if you stayed in there. But anytime after the first couple of days when I left my room and came back, it was through this incredible blast of really fetidly stale air. It was unbelievable. It was almost like a wall of this stuff. And nonetheless, I continued to have room parties because why not? And one of them was the room party. The room was filled with people. It must have been over 20 people in that room. Every available surface was occupied. But there was, and it seemed like it was one of those parties where there were lots of really good conversations taking place and ideas being kicked around. And I realized at some point, and this was relatively early, like only 9 or 10 at night, that one person who should have been there wasn't, and that was, you guessed it, Lucy Hunziker. So I called her room. I think she may have gone to bed. I'm not sure. But anyway, I told her she needed to be there, and she did come to the party. And at that party, people started kicking around the ideas, as people will in a fanciful way, about I think we were originally talking about the Science Fiction Writers of America, the SFWA, SIFWA, and we we were mocking it and ridiculing it. And somewhere along the line, the concept of founding the Fan Writers of America was born. Now, I honestly don't remember who came up with the concept of the name first. I believe it was a group effort, but I can be corrected if necessary. Uh, it There have been others who have published accounts of it in fanzines and whatnot on e-lists over the years since then, each of whom seem to have been central to it, each of whom contributed some insight. So at this point, I'm not sure where it really originated, but I picked up the ball and ran with it. And we decided to create the Fan Writers of America. And the whole concept was a farce, of course. The first thing we decided was that in the interest of American imperialism, America would include the entire world. So all fan writers in the entire world were eligible. Secondly, if you thought you were a fan writer, you were a member. It was that simple. There were no attempts to exclude anyone for any reason. Uh, totally open. And the third thing was that in mockery of all of the business that destroys organizations, including the Science Fiction Writers of America, which gets mired down in their elections and their power plays and whatnot. So much so that I left the SIFWA in the mid-70s in disgust. So we decided that while we would have officers, none of them would be present officers. They would all be past officers. That we would pick our president, and that was the only office we ever settled on. We would pick our president for the previous year, the year just ended, and go from there. So there would never be a current president of the FOA. There would only be past presidents. And initially, we didn't have a really good way to pick them out. I mean, I think we picked the first one in that room party, although I'm not sure anymore. We then were picking them out at some world cons. I mean, that was a world con. We picked the last one that was picked, I think, was at the Atlanta World Con a couple of years later. And there may have been some picked in the interim in Corflu, but it didn't really settle down until after the Atlanta World Con to being an event at the Corflus, having a actual voting on the past president at the Corflu, at the so-called business session or luncheon on Sunday. And that has worked out extremely well. People used to come up to me and ask me who I had picked for the past year, and I would say, I haven't picked anybody. Who do you recommend? And they would come up with names, and I'd say, okay, nominate them. And they would. And sometimes in the course of nominations, other people I hadn't thought of were nominated, and sometimes they won. Good for them. Some years, it's been kind of obvious who should get it, for various reasons like age, fact that they're actually present at the Corflu, stuff like that. And sometimes after the first nomination, I'll call for nominations to close and unanimous acclaim voting. But usually there is a vote, and I actually do count hands and see who won. And it's a fun tradition that has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. You can say past, present, FOA after your name if you are one, and an increasing number of people are these days. And that's fine because we should spread it around. The whole concept, if there is one, is to honor people who've done good fan writing, and that never gets sufficient recognition, and always deserves more. So that is how the FOA came about. And where is John anyway?
I'm right here.
Oh, there you are. My God, you're in a different spot on my screen now.
Oh,
So you're back. You have
yep. The only other one I have here from your list was the single word APAs.
hmm. Well, that's a broad topic, which we can narrow down as we please, I guess. I mean, APAs precede fandom, but were introduced to fandom by Don Wollheim, who has had much to answer for in fandom. And FAPA is probably his proudest achievement because it's still going after all these years. And that's astonishing in and of itself, considering all of the cultural changes we've been through, the technological changes, what have you. So there's that. Of course, originally FAPA was conceived as a central mailing point for all the fanzines in fandom. Everybody would send their fanzines to one person, he'd send them out to everybody. And that way everybody traded with everybody and didn't have to maintain your own mailing list. Well, I don't think that concept lasted more than a mailing, if that. Then some people were doing zines for FAPA in addition to their Gen zines. And FAPA very quickly developed its own traditions, primary among them the mailing comment, which then would take over large parts of many FAPA zines. In fact, some FAPA zines were all mailing comments on the previous mailing. So you had this conversation going. It was quarterly, but back in those days, you know, we did a lot more correspondence by mail. We were used to a slower pace. It was not an uncomfortable pace. And indeed, by the late 40s, there were some fans in New Jersey who felt that FAPA wasn't enough and we should start a second APA. And they started the Spectator Amateur Press Society, which was SAPS. I believe SAPS is also still going to this day, albeit like FAPA with a lot fewer members. But SAPS was, you know, the break in the dam. And after that, other APAs came along. Now, actually, before SAPS, there was VAPA, the Vanguard Amateur Press Association, but that was an elite group aimed at people who were semi-pros and considered to be fandom's intelligentsia, you know, the Jim Blishes of the world. It wasn't really fanish, and it only lasted a few mailings anyway. But after SAPS, in the early 50s, there were a number of abortive attempts, and some successful, at creating new APAs. The first successful one was called the Cult because it was created around the new concept in APAs, a rotating APA publication which was put out in turn by each of the members on a fairly frequent schedule. I think the first schedule was weekly, but it became bi-weekly fairly soon after that. Guy named Peter Vorsimer, who was a brief flame in mid-50s fandom. He's the founder of the cult. He named it because there were 13 members he'd picked. And I was one of the charter members, as were a number of my friends. It was basically our generation of fandom for the most part. And that caught on. That was successful. That lasted, as far as I know, it's still going, but I believe it's now entirely online. Um, it, um, I stayed a member well into the 60s and then dropped out because I was increasingly not interested in it. But by then, there were a number of other APAs around. There were APAs modeled on the cult. There were APAs that were modeled on the more traditional models, FAPA and SAPS. There was Southern Fandom's APA, which came up in the early 60s. And there were a variety of short-lived cult-like APAs, of which I was a member of at least one called TAPS. Uh, but they got out of hand quickly. I mean, there was APA 50. That was for fans born after 1950, which at the time was just the youngest fans because this was in the middle 60s. But, subsequently, there were more and more offshoot splinter type APAs of various sorts. And I guess it was 62, the first private APA was created. And I was also a part of that. I had been a member of a group called CRAP, which is the Carbon Reproduced Amateur Press. And it was originally done by a handful of young fans using carbon copies to each other. So, limited to 3 or 4 or 5 people. And at some point, they decided that carbon could refer to the carbon in Mimeo ink, or even in a Dittomaster, although I don't think there is any carbon in Dittomaster. But in any event, they were called carbon sheets, so they managed to slide in on that. And in 1960, I was asked to join at the Worldcon that year, and I did. And that APA lasted another half a year or so, and then it was disbanded by 2 members of it. I think they may have been Robert Lickman and Andy Main, but I wouldn't swear to it. They decided to create a private APA, one which would exclude certain people who'd been in crap. Now, the reason was that those people were what were then called omni-Athens. These were people who wanted to be in every single APA in existence. Prime among them, Bruce Pels, but there were several others as well. And they were essentially in the APA to collect the mailings, not to be valued participants. And so the founders of the new private APA decided that you couldn't just join because you needed to be in every APA. There had to be a better reason than that. And they called this APA APA X, which soon became known as Apex. And Apex was a fascinating private APA which had maybe a dozen members and a lot of personal writing, people who are going through emotional turmoil in their lives, writing about it. But members included people like Abram Davidson and Walter Green, among others. And Walter introduced us to someone who called himself Luis Zamora, Luis. And Luis Zamora introduced himself as a high school misbehavior who actually left his feces in high school water fountains and the like. And within, I don't know, a short period of time, maybe 6 months or less, Luis Zamora was revealed to be a woman named Gretchen Schwen. Gretchen Schwen subsequently became Red Boggs's live-in housemate, girlfriend. And it was Gretchen Schwen who famously in 1964 bit Bob Buckley in the ankle when he was trying to remove her from the Worldcon. And she was down on the floor. I actually saw that take place. It was a fantastic thing to see. But eventually, Apex folded, died, and another APA was created in the same general period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years after Apex, called what was originally called App Assembly. And it was most of the BNFs in fandom. And they too were, it was a private group. And as various of my friends, including Dave Van Arnhem, were invited to join, I found out that I was blackballed by Dean Grinnell from that group. Something that I don't think I ever entirely got over, because he was blackballing me from friends like Terry Carr and Dave Van Arnhem and Dick Woodblock and so forth. But I lived through it. I survived. I wrote books and edited prozines instead. But certainly in the 70s, APAs, just to get back to the original topic here, they they bloomed. A thousand flowers bloomed in fandom, and it became a massive thing in itself. It became almost an offshoot of fandom. There were people who joined fandom to join some local APA and never knew about the rest of fandom, just their own APA, which I found kind of strange. There were weekly APAs. In the mid 60s, APA F was created in the FANA class, which alternated meetings weekly with FISFA, and mailings were collated at each meetings. That spawned APA L. We killed APA F with mailing 69. APA L is still going to this day. I think APAs are now in eclipse and decline. They've been replaced by the internet.
Yeah. This might be a good time for us to throw open to questions, see if anybody has any questions.
Why not? I think we've used.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many more stories I could tell, but without something to spur them, I don't know which one.
Right. And we've certainly at least run through what you've given me and I've written down. So questions, feel free, audience.
Which you have to unmute to do.
Yeah, you'll have to.
You have one from Ivan in the chat window.
If I get a question, wait a minute, yeah. If I get a question about non-FANAC, it would be this. Please talk about your time editing the prozines Amazing and Fantastic. I loved both of them, and you actually published some big names, including Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and Mauser stories. I tried to break into print by sending dozens of stories to the bogus address, and was so devastated when I found out I'd been dumping stories down a well that I stopped writing SF.
Who said that?
Ivan Van Lanningham.
Okay. What was the bogus address? Do you know? I mean, was it Saul Cohen's address in Queens? Or was it, because see, I had a post office box in Falls Church where I received manuscripts as well as letters that come in on the issues and all the rest. But some people sent their manuscripts to the publisher's address in Queens. I never saw most of those. I mean,
Right.
I never personally read most of the slush myself at Amazing and Fantastic because I spent 5 years doing it for FNSF and I was burned out on reading slush. But I had local people, after a while they were members of my writers group, reading the slush for me. But in New York, I don't know what Saul was doing with the manuscripts he was receiving until Moshe Feder hove on the scene. And Moshe lived in Queens and was kind of pushy about wanting to do something for the magazines. And so Saul let him read manuscripts, the ones that Saul got. And Moshe passed a few on to me, not many. And I used at least one. And I recall that Moshe then tried to foment a discord between Saul Cohen, the publisher, and myself. He complained to Saul that I had published this story in Fantastic rather than Amazing, and he thought it belonged in Amazing. And so Saul was saying to me, why did you put it in Fantastic? Moshe thinks it should be in Amazing. I said, because it was fantasy. It had magic in it. That's not science fiction. That goes in fantastic. See, Amazing was, as I saw it, a relatively straight ahead mainstream SF magazine. It took chances on stuff, but it had to be real SF. Whereas all of the other stuff, from sword and sorcery to surreal fantasy, belonged in fantastic. I saw fantastic as having a much broader umbrella, and in a lot of ways, I thought it was the more interesting of the two magazines in terms of the fiction published. But at one point, I decided that there needed to be some reward for the slush pile readers. And I introduced the policy that manuscripts from unsolicited authors, people I had never bought from and didn't know, would require a quarter, 25 cents, to accompany the submission. And the slush pile reader got to keep the quarter. Now, if you read a couple dozen manuscripts, that was a few bucks. It was of course, a full pocket of quarters. But there was kickback
Do your
on,
laundry.
blowback on that. There were a lot of people who complained and resisted. I thought, Jesus Christ, how paid can you get? You can't afford a quarter? You're paying nearly that much for the return postage. You know, get real here. Give something to my poor starving slush pile readers. So that's how that all came about. I don't know if that answers your question though, because again, I don't really know what became of your stories, whether they actually came to me or not. If you got them back in the mail with a rejection slip, then my readers saw it. If you got them back without a rejection slip, or I don't know what it was, it's awesome. I have no concept. After a certain point, I created a special rejection slip letter that I mimeographed myself that was based on something that I had heard John Campbell had once done, although I'm not going to it. I mean, I made submissions to John Campbell, both of my own stories and of Bob Shaw's when I was aging. Campbell always accepted or rejected with letters. I mean, he rejected a story of mine that ended up in FNSF with a 2-page letter. So, you know, that wasn't, for a rejection, that wasn't bad. But Ray Palmer was the other one. And Ray Palmer had some kind of a category checkmark kind of rejection slip that he could check off reasons why your manuscript had been rejected. I liked that idea, but I didn't have any copies of his rejection slips to work from, so I just had to come up with one of my own. And I just came up with all the common reasons why people's stories were rejected, and put them with a box next to them that the slush pile reader could check off as appropriate. And I hope that was helpful to readers, or prospective writers, I should say. Back when I was reading Slush for FNSF, at one point Ed Furman said to me, "You really shouldn't put any encouraging notes on these." They had this kind of form rejection slip that was printed on the back of the cover. So it was digest size rejection slip. And sometimes I would put something at the bottom saying, keep trying, you know, something like that, because somebody was a near miss. I'd almost liked it enough to pass it along. And Ed said, "Don't do that. It just encourages them."
It's the idea.
I mean, you know, I've always been professionally both an editor and a writer, and I've always seen things from both points of view pretty much at the same time. More questions?
Yeah. Questions? Answers?
We're not.
Greg, you're
I was going to say that actually working with Ted in the early days of my writing career, when I was actually also a postdoc for Edward Teller, was very instructive, and he really set me on course in a way that led to a real writing career. And I wonder if I would have succeeded if it hadn't been for working with Ted. Of course, we'd already worked on Void, but to me, it was very useful and got me through an interesting period between my PhD and becoming a professor 4 years later. And so thanks, Ted.
Well, at that time, Greg, you were at that facility in the Bay Area where you had access to a Watts line.
Right.
In those days, long distance calls were too expensive for most people to do for more than a minute or two. But with a Watts line, you could talk as long as you liked.
Yes.
And you used to call me at least once a week, maybe more often on occasion. And it would be late in my morning. It would be even earlier in your morning. And I would still be in bed, but I had a phone by my bedside, and I would just answer you and lie in bed and talk to you. And we talked for what, half an hour to an hour sometimes.
Exactly. You're a text dollar at work.
Yeah. Well, I enjoyed those conversations. I mean, I thought they had a nice two-way flow to them. I didn't feel it was all me instructing you or anything.
It was terrifically useful too.
That was when you won an FNSF story contest.
That's right. That was in 65. But I got my PhD in 67, and I started calling you on the Watts line in late 67 and for several years. Because, as I said, I was a postdoc for 2 years, and then I was staff member. And after 2 years, I got a better offer at UC Irvine, so I went there, which Teller really did not want me to do. But sanity prevailed.
There was a time when you were calling me. I was at Stanford starting at fall of 67 rather.
Right.
You would call me early in my morning because you were there. And then you would call Ted early in his morning.
Oh, I was a pest.
Yeah, you were, but a very entertaining pest.
It was really good to have free phone. Come on.
I personally, I felt I got a lot of feedback from you, Greg. I mean, you were much taken with my first juvenile, as I recall.
Oh, yeah. You got the Marauder satellite. It was very Heinlein-esque.
It was on purpose, yes.
And me too.
I mean, at that way that came about was Henry Morrison, who was better known in fandom in the early 50s as Henry Moskowitz, but had to change his name when he started working for Scott Meredith. He had left Scott Meredith in the 60s and started his own agency. And we had known each other. Hell, we'd corresponded in the early 50s, in fact. And I had worked for Scott for a few months in 63. And so he called me up and he told me he was now his own agency and asked me if I had an agent, wanted one. We agreed he would become my agent. And one of the first things he suggested was that I do a juvenile. He said, do you know what Poul Anderson's best-selling book is? And it was his Winston Juvenile.
Right.
Fault of the Ages, something like that.
Yes.
And he said, you should write a juvenile. And I thought, wow, I grew up on Heinlein's juveniles. They turned me on to real science fiction. I've always admired Heinlein's work, although by then not his late stuff. And I kind of analyzed what I thought went into a Heinlein juvenile and wrote Secret of the Marauder Satellite directly as a result of that. And I was pretty pleased with what resulted, although Terry Carr pointed out to me after the fact that I had two basic plot threads and I did not resolve them simultaneously. One resolved significantly before the other. And he saw that as the only flaw in the book, but I didn't see any way that could have been changed. So that was fine with me. And
I agree.
the book did extremely well. It went into 5 printings in hardcover. It got rave reviews from the Virginia Kirkus and the Library Journal. It was uh, judged by P. Schuyler Miller and Analog as the best SF juvenile of the year. The only review that it ever got, I think, was Terry's review of it, which I think was an FNSF. But it got me on a New York City radio station where I fielded questions from high school student readers, and they were very intelligent questions. I enjoyed that. I was invited to tea with the woman who ran the New York Public Library System, and I was picked out as one of the best books of the year by the New York Public Library System. I mean, that book did real well for me. It's a shame I was not able to really follow up on its success. And the reason for that was the publisher, a Philadelphia publisher, they loved me. I once spent an entire day in Philadelphia as their guest, took me out to lunch and all that stuff. And I was just, their pride and joy, because I probably was their bestseller. And then they changed editors on me. And when I turned in my second juvenile to them, the new editor had nothing invested in me, didn't give a crap for me. And the first thing she did was cut out the first 1 or 2 chapters of the book. And I didn't find this out until I received the galleys to read.
Oh.
And the book was called Trouble on Project Series.
Right.
And it's about a desert reclamation project in western Nevada. And I actually talked to you, Greg, about some of the science involved.
Yes.
And just to make sure, I like to get my science accurate. I think the real reason the book received the treatment it did from its publisher was because I had made the protagonist black.
Oh.
And he's first person, and you don't know he's black until midway into the book when he's confronted by bigots. And that's the first you find out. And to this day, I'm proud of myself. Although for all I know, Black Lives Matter people regard me as an interloper. But I had one of the first black protagonists in science fiction.
That's right.
First person narrator.
Yeah, and it was a good idea too. As I recall, it was taking water from the Colorado River, using something like solar power to dissociate it into hydrogen and oxygen, shipping hydrogen to LA as a fuel source, energy source, and expelling the oxygen, which actually is clever, although it's also very dangerous.
Well, yeah.
A light a match.
It was Pacific Ocean water being shipped to the Nevada desert. But that was the principle, and the danger does figure into it. There is an explosive pipeline.
That's right.
Point. And that's one of the things I checked with you. How do you cause that explosion? And you do it by dropping pressure and allowing things to mix. At any rate, the other interesting thing about that book is that the first chapter, which takes place in a college dorm as everybody's packing up and leaving for the summer, involves mention of the terrible Benford twins.
Yes.
And that was one of the things that fell by the wayside when this woman took my chapter out. I mean, she also made the ending of the book a rabbit from the hat because the setup was in the first chapter. And I had to go through the galleys and make insertions and corrections to cover that in the published version. But the book did not do well. It wasn't promoted at all by its publisher. It got lukewarm reviews and just kind of disappeared.
Yeah. Who was the publisher? Winston?
No, I've forgotten their name momentarily, but it was a Philadelphia publisher. They're not well known for SF. nothing as grand as Winston.
Yeah.
We should probably try to wrap this up on the hour. And Sandra Bond had a question.
Oh,
Well, let me just wrap this topic
Yeah, yeah.
that way by saying that I took that first chapter and gave it to Linda Bushhager, who published it in her Genzine at the time, so it would stay in print. And now I have sold ebook rights to that book and I think also print on demand rights to another publisher. And I restored the first chapter, took out
oh.
the changes I made, and now the book is complete as I wrote it.
Well, what's the name? I want to buy it.
Double
Yeah.
Unfit series.
Oh, right.
Yep. You're back in it.
Okay.
Both of you guys.
Immortality at last.
The return of the terrible Benford twins.
I might make a comment, and that is that the Benford twins also appear in Timescape.
That's true.
When we asked graduate students at UC's La Jolla, which we really were at the time. So it was quite realistic. In fact, a lot of the things in Timescape about UC then are have real people in it. And it's true. All the philandering and all that stuff, that's real.
It all felt very true to life, I remember.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Oh, Sandra.
Sandra, you want to unmute and ask it, or do you want me to read it?
Whatever does the job.
Well, Sandra says, can you tell us a little about Dr. Progresso and possibly also the collecting channel story?
Oh,
That's two questions. Oh, Ted, you've gotten muted somehow.
It said there the host had muted me. I have unmuted. Dr. Progresso is somebody I created in the mid 70s. When I started out, I was doing a column of reviews for a local DC monthly paper called Unicorn Times, and I was reviewing mostly Italian imported progressive rock albums, very few of which were known in this country and many of which were superb. So I called myself Dr. Progresso. Then after I started doing that column, I was invited to be on a local radio station, WGTB, the Georgetown University radio station, where I got a weekly Friday afternoon time slot, 3 to 6, as Dr. Progresso. I did a 3-hour radio show. And that's how the name got started. I had a pickup group of musicians who played locally called Dr. Progresso and the Hired Assassins. I played saxophone with them. What was the other side of it? Of that?
The collecting channel.
Oh, yeah, it's the collecting channel. I was with them for a little over a year. It was something that was started up by a man who had been Arnie Katz's agent earlier and started this partnership with another fellow down in Richmond, Virginia, to launch this website called the Collecting Channel. And it was very ambitious, and there was like daily content being supplied to all of these various sub-channels, like one on comics, one on music, one on movies, one on TV, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Miniature war devices, all kinds of things. I mean, anything that was collectible, we had a channel for it. And at its height, I don't know, we had 20 or 30 channels at least. And Arnie hired a lot of fans, Andy Hooper among them, Steve Stiles, Bob Stewart, all to manage one of these channels. I was the first outside hire. The original hires were Arnie, Joyce, and Bill
Uncle. Mm-hmm.
And I was the first outside hire. And after me, the deluge. And I was writing initially about comics and also about music, I think, maybe jazz, maybe just music. I can't remember now. And that was a pretty heavy workload. You were writing 1,000 to 2,000 words a day, finished copy. But they were paying me well. They were giving me, in fact, the highest salary I've ever been paid for anything, double what I was getting of heavy metal.
Oh,
And that was swell. But the business model for the company was a complete failure. I mean, it was based on investor money. They never had much of any cash flow. And when the investor money dried up, so did the company. So I lasted from January of 1999 till March of 2000. I went to Corflu that year. I think it was in Seattle, and a bunch of us had just been fired, and we all commiserated. I mean, about 2/3 of the staff were laid off in one fell swoop, myself among them. At that point, I was managing 4 channels and writing 1. And I had overseen the hiring of people like Bob Stewart and Steve Stiles, who were excellent at their jobs. And it was great to just be in touch with Bob again on a regular daily basis. And just in general, you know, it was good while it lasted, but it was grueling work, and I think I would have burned out sooner or later, but I never had the chance. So let's see here. It's 1 minute away from 6, and I'm
yeah.
coffee cup.
Shall we call it a wrap?
I think we're going to say we've got questions in, and do appreciate Ted and John lasting with us this long. It was great information.
We can do it forever.
Yeah, and I think some of it might even be a bit controversial. So maybe we'll get some good response on it.
I've always been controversial.
Oh, I never noticed that, Ted.
Even if I was bland, there would be someone who would object.
Well, want to thank you both, and thank you all for coming.